Ferrari ended a long losing streak stretching back nearly 4 years when Gerhard Berger won the 1994 German Grand Prix, yet that was only one of the huge storylines that played out over a baking hot summer's weekend at Hockenheim. Off track there was plenty of controversy, as ever in 1994, and in the pit lane there was horror as everyone's fears about the return of refuelling played out in front of the world's TV cameras for 7 agonising seconds. Joining me, Glenn Freeman, to look back on an unforgettable weekend in F1 history are Edd Straw, and I'm delighted to welcome a special guest making his first appearance on the show, longtime F1 journalist Tony Dodgins, who was at Hockenheim that weekend reporting all the drama for Autosport. So Tony, welcome along and thanks for joining us. We start every show with the same opening question. So when you think back to the 1994 German Grand Prix, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
Well, first off, Glenn, thanks for having me on the programme. It's great to be on. And when I remember that weekend, the thing that stands out for me is Ross Brawn's Friday press conference after the investigation into the electronics on the Benetton from Imola. That's the first thing. And then the second thing, obviously, those the images and the reality of that pit fire. It was shocking at the time. People had predicted from the return of refueling that it was inevitably going to happen somewhere, and there we were, sort of a few months down the line, and there it was, and it was sort of fairly horrifying at the time.
Yeah, we're going to get into both of those in quite a lot of detail. Certainly, there was a lot to say about what Benetton was up to, like I said earlier, as ever in 1994. But Ed, given how many of your favourite unfancied teams scored points in this race, dare I ask what your overriding memory is?
Yeah, it's the same as that of any right-thinking F1 fan, which is a glorious day for the two great French teams. Double podium for Ligier, Olivier Panis, second Eric Bernard, third in a season when it hadn't scored any points before. Eric Comas, sixth for Larousse's last points. The only disappointment was that it wasn't two Larousses in the points, given Olivier Beretta was seventh. But I'm sure we're going to spend most of the episode talking about those two topics specifically, so I'll stop there.
No, that's all we're going to do to talk about those, so that's your participation in this podcast over. Before we get going, let's catch up on a few more shout-outs to those of you who have given us 5-star reviews. So thank you to MH613, Joseph of the K, J Rose 0329, Cal's biggest fan, and LH fanboy. Keep the reviews coming in if you're listening on Apple Podcasts. I do my best to keep up with them, and we really appreciate it. And remember to get your questions in about anything to do with F1 from the V10 era from 1989 to 2005 for our series finale episodes. You can submit them using the hashtag BringBackV10s on Twitter, or you can email bringbackv10s@the-race.com. And if you want to get early access to ad-free versions of the show, plus bonus content between series, check out the Race Members Club. To find out more about all the other benefits you can get and to go and sign up, head to the-race.com/members club. Now let's get on with Hockenheim 94. The German Grand Prix marked the next in-season changes being made to slow the cars down, including the addition of the 10mm plank being put underneath the cars to increase the ride height and reduce downforce. The teams tried the planks out at a couple of tests. At Paul Ricard, they were around 4 to 5 seconds slower than they'd been in pre-season when the cars still had lots of downforce. Then at Silverstone, they were roughly 2 seconds off the pace set at the very recent British Grand Prix, where the cars had already been running in reduced trim with the changes that were made after for the Spanish Grand Prix. Championship leader Michael Schumacher said the car was more difficult to drive with the plank, but not bad, but it was tougher to set up. And Benetton designer Rory Byrne said the car required a completely different setup. Eddie Irvine said it made the cars better to drive as they slid around more. Mark Blundell questioned if keeping the power levels the same and reducing grip really made the cars safer, while Mika Hakkinen believed the changes made his McLaren better. Williams also felt that way. Design genius Adrian Newey wrote in his book that raising the ride height helped solve the problem he'd been having with the front of the side pod being too close to the ground on the FW16, something we talked about in our Brazil 1994 episode a few series back. By this point, Williams was running shorter side pods to help get around that, and Newey said, although we lost downforce, it made the problems we'd been wrestling that were causing the aerodynamic stall less of a problem, because the side pod was now 10mm higher than it was before. So Tony, you had the job during the season of trying to keep up with all these changes and all the testing that was going on every time more adjustments were made to the rules. What did you think of the introduction of the plank for Hockenheim?
It was quite amusing initially because, you have all these fantastic high-tech pieces of machinery, then they lob a plank of wood on the bottom of them, and you thought, there's got to be something a bit more sophisticated than this. But I think there was a need to be seen to do something to slow the cars down and everything, and it was just something they came up with and did. And I was intrigued most of all, I think, to see how it affected the competitive picture between Benetton and Williams as much as anything.
Yeah, they could have come up with a better name for it than a plank as well, couldn't they?
Yeah.
But ultimately, that is what it looked like.
It wasn't very Formula One.
No,
was it?
no. As well as the new rule specs, Ferrari was in the early phase of adapting to a B-spec version of its 412 T1 car, which had been updated by Gustav Brunner. In his regular column for Autosport magazine, John Alesi called the changes Brunner had made very positive, saying, "Not all the faults have been rectified, but despite requiring some more development work, it feels competitive." But these updates were the result of huge tension behind the scenes at Ferrari. This car had originally been designed by John Barnard, who had come up with a unique side pod concept aimed at reducing internal drag. So he had a small radiator in one side pod and a bigger one in the other. The idea was that the side pods were slightly bigger overall, but they allowed for air to travel through them better, reducing overall drag. However, the car had constant cooling problems, which the engine department put down to Barnard's side pods. Barnard said in his brilliant book titled The Perfect Car, he came under pressure from Jean Todt and Luca di Montezemolo to tell them who was to blame, classic Ferrari, and he ended up firing Dominic Smith, who was the main engineer who had worked on the radiator design. However, later on, when the cooling package needed another redesign to accommodate Brunner's new barge boards, it was discovered that the engine people hadn't been controlling the water flows to the radiators properly, so 2/3 of the water was going through the small radiator and only 1/3 to the big radiator. This still bothers Barnard today. He said in his book, "It was all such a waste of valuable time. We could have concentrated on the car's performance, but instead we got lost in incompetence and politics. Those engine people, again, they screwed us royally. They didn't care. All they had to keep doing was throw the ball back to the chassis people, saying there's not enough cooling, it's running too hot. They just hadn't looked at it." So Ed, do you get anything more typical Ferrari for this era than that story?
Yeah, it is absolutely classic Ferrari, isn't it? Both for that era and a few other periods. But it was changing. Jean Todt had been there for about a year at that point. I think the French Grand Prix the previous year was his first. Pretty standard behaviour for Luca di Montezemolo. He always seemed to favour the idea of blaming one individual and then getting rid of them and then, whoa, your problem's fixed. Todd did later prove himself to be a little bit more constructive than that, fortunately. But it is completely absurd to have a known problem, the lack of cooling, and not investigate the reasons for this properly. So maybe there was a valuable lesson for Todt there in terms of how damaging that blame culture can be. But there's wider concerns because obviously, although Barnard's blamed the engine side there, was Barnard asking these questions and trying to get that checked? We don't really know. The fact they had these two disconnected parts, you had FDD, Ferrari Design and Development, which was Barnard's operation in the UK. He insisted he was based there, so they set it up. In fact, it's the second time they set up a Ferrari design and development hub in Guildford, I think, because they'd done it before for him in his previous stint with the team. And Todd did recognise that they needed to get everything a little bit more integrated. Barnard didn't want to do that, or rather didn't want to be based in Italy, so he later down the line walked away. But I think it also shows a fundamental problem that Ferrari had there, because who knows, if Barnard was based at Maranello with everyone else, maybe he'd have been able to build a slightly more constructive relationship with the engine department. Certainly that followed in subsequent years. But yeah, not a good reflection of Ferrari, and it shows that it wasn't the work of a moment for Jean Todt to change the culture of that team.
Well, talking of Todt, Gerhard Berger believed things were changing at Ferrari, and he credited that to Todt, who, as Ed said there, had been in charge of the team for just over a year by this point. In an interview with Nigel Roebuck, Berger said, "At first there was no structure in the team at all, but now they've got some very good people. I'm a big fan of Todt. He's far less political than the people who were there before. He's made a huge difference. I could bring some of the links in the chain to Ferrari, but I couldn't join them together. That's what Todt has done, and now the team is working as a team. But Todt still had plenty of fires to fight in this era. Barnard complained about Brunner's return, believing that Brunner was telling Todt everything that was wrong with the car, and it was Todt who decided that Brunner could update it, effectively making the decision and then giving Barnard very little choice but to agree with it. Alesi also caused trouble around this time when he criticised Barnard's front suspension layout. Todt reassured Barnard that Alesi had been told to abstain from divulging any technical information regarding the car and that the necessary steps had been taken to prevent it happening again. And in a fax that Todt sent to Barnard, he included a line saying, "It is also fundamental for Ferrari's image to present ourselves to the outside as a team which has no internal conflict and which has a unitary vision on all issues." So Tony, you were there at the time, you were going to the races. What did you make of the impression Todt was making at Ferrari by this point, effectively a year in? And was that faxed line to Barnard perhaps quite telling, that maybe Todt's ambition to begin with was to control the external message while he sorted out the mess internally?
Well, I mean, if you think back to that time, they'd been sort of largely irrelevant in terms of ultimate competitiveness since kind of the end of '90, and they wouldn't be a sort of a championship challenging force again until kind of '97. So at that time, you just thought, they're in a mess, and how long is it going to take to sort out? Because, I mean, I remember actually talking to Ivan Capelli, who was there in '92, and of course, an Italian, driving for Ferrari, it was like his lifetime's ambition. And yet the first time he met his race engineer was on the steps to the aircraft going to the first race, So it was that kind of a shambles. And at that time, Todt had this, obviously very strong organizational reputation because of what he'd achieved with Peugeot, and you suspected he would have an impact and get it right, but you knew it was going to take time. So I don't think anybody was looking for immediate results, not even Montezemolo.
You mentioned Peugeot there, and they were fighting some different kinds of fires of their own in Formula One. Mainly around preventing their McLaren engines from blowing up in 1994. Bizarrely, McLaren and Peugeot sent out a joint press release that included a Q&A with Peugeot sport boss Jean-Pierre Jabouille, which I think the aim was to calm down any tension, although when you read it, it was a little hard to tell. But Jabouille started by saying, contrary to what some people think, relations between McLaren and Peugeot are excellent. I would even say they have never been so good. Right from the start, the balance between the front and the rear of the MP49 was difficult to define. The modifications to the regulations have accentuated the difficulties. McLaren boss Ron Dennis said he felt McLaren and Peugeot had raised expectations because we were too successful too quickly, which is quite hard to recall from the early part of 1994. But Tony, like I say, we look back now on the McLaren-Peugeot partnership, and it's just, the images are of the cars blowing up. Halfway through their first season together, and Peugeot's first season in F1, what was the perception in the paddock?
I think the perception was that, here was a company with the potential to run at the front based on what they'd achieved in sports cars as well. You were sort of waiting for them to make progress. And Martin Brundle had that sort of second place in Monaco, and I think Mika was third in the restarted San Marino race. So, they'd had a couple of podiums, and as, Ron said, too much too early. But, that was surrounded by about 12 retirements in glorious flames of orange and red. And, they didn't just blow up in a puff of smoke. They blew up spectacularly. And in the background, there was always this thing about the Chrysler as well. The following year, Senna had done a test with a Chrysler engine, and he wanted to run, it's effectively the Lamborghini, and he wanted to run that. And of course, then he went off to Williams. He wanted to run it in the last three races, but McLaren had already, unbeknown to him, inked a contract with Peugeot. And I remember that he did a test, and it was going to cause McLaren a contractual problem if he'd gone quicker than X based on what they'd achieved with their Ford, which they were trying to replace. And Davey, there's a great story Martin Whitmarsh told me about Davey Ryan phoning him from the test saying, I can't stop it. It's actually quick and it's got Ayrton inside it. So what do you expect me to do? And, Martin said, well, take Ayrton somewhere and chuck a load of fuel in it and don't tell him. And I think that's how, I think there had been some speculation that they would run that. And the Peugeot thing was a bit of a, oh my God, it surprised a few people. And they patently weren't ready, and it makes you wonder whether they pushed it through, quickly, because that was, McLaren were in a situation in that time, and it ended up, as we know, being just a 1-year deal, and they went to Merck the following year. But I suspect they just weren't ready.
The thing that's particularly brilliant about that statement they put out is the timing, because we just had the British Grand Prix, and of course, what happened at the British Grand Prix? Martin Brundle's engine had one of those detonations that Tony referred to on the grid as the race was starting. So you saw this enormous, just instant blow up, which to me is the enduring memory of the McLaren Peugeot. So I just like the fact they put out a release basically saying, "Yep, it's all fine. We're all getting on really well." When you've got this metaphor for the relationship blowing up happening in front of everyone watching. It wasn't just a car pulling over. Everybody was looking, and there it went, like literally an explosion. Brilliant stuff.
A story for another time, of course, but they tried to blame Brundle for that as well. But that's not the only topic in this episode that I will leave for when we do Silverstone 94 in a future series. But let's talk about another French F1 connection that was in the news around this time, because there were reports linking Alain Prost yet again to potentially buying a stake in Ligier. This was the third time these rumours had surfaced, having happened previously when he was fired by Ferrari at the end of 1991, and again when he retired as world champion at the end of 1993. Now, Ed, we won't spend too long on this, but it's as good a chance as any to flag up that we're doing an episode on Prost finally buying this team and its first season in 1997. We get requests about this team all the time, but by mid-94, when these rumours came up again, did it seem an inevitability that this was going to happen at some point?
The Ligier requests show what a discerning audience Bring Back V10s has, I have to say. But yeah, Prost and Ligier, it was almost becoming one of those eternal never happens by this stage, and it's constantly talked about. We've talked about it before. Other times this has cropped up in the past on Bring Back V10s. But it made sense at this time because the team was going through a period of instability. It had that for a few years, massively underachieving. Renault Works engines, Williams gearbox, but was fairly poor. So it made sense that those rumours came up, and Prost was certainly actively continuing to pursue his interest. Then you had all the ownership shenanigans with Benetton using Ligier to make absolutely sure it could get access to the Renault engines. It's just amazing, isn't it, though? Because on paper it made so much sense, didn't it? Ligier, the French national team, it had government support, whether that was direct through Lotto sponsorship, for example, in the past, or leaning on other companies to create kind of indirect money into Ligier. Prost, the French national hero, ideally placed to draw in more backing, and with massive pull outside of France as well, because he's one of the greatest Grand Prix drivers ever. So whenever these cropped up, it sounded like the perfect solution, didn't it? And of course, when it finally happened way down the line, you'd have to conclude it was a little bit of a waste of time that it ever happened. I imagine Alain Prost feels it was a bit of an unworthwhile project for him, given how he feels about it. But just the eternal thing that never happened, and it really should have stayed as a never happened, shouldn't it?
The big news ahead of the German Grand Prix was that Michael Schumacher was going to be banned from his home race. He'd picked up a 2-race ban for ignoring the black flag at the British Grand Prix after overtaking Damon Hill on the formation lap. As I mentioned with the Brundle Peugeot stuff, we'll save the deeper look into all of that black flag stuff for a future episode on that race. But there was uproar in Germany over the ban, and Benetton waited until the last minute to decide to appeal so Schumacher could race at Hockenheim. Getting Schumacher to race under appeal seemed like the easy way to make sure Germany's new F1 superstar raced in front of the packed grandstand, but Benetton team boss Flavio Briatore revealed in 2020 that he wanted to serve the ban at Hockenheim because of Benetton's underpowered Cosworth V8 engine, which would get blown away by the Ferraris and the Williams Renaults on the track's long straights. And Flavio claims that Schumacher agreed with this. Briatore told Tom Clarkson on the official F1 Beyond the Grid podcast, "We needed to choose the races we would miss with Michael, and I chose Hockenheim. We wanted to win the World Championship. We don't want to win the home race. I was in agreement with Michael. Michael was not really wanting to race. There was a revolution at Hockenheim. People were hunting Williams mechanics, and Max Mosley called me with the mayor of Hockenheim, saying people were starting fires in the forest. So Ed, with everything that was going on here, ultimately did common sense prevail to make sure Schumacher took part in his home race?
Yeah, I think from a wider F1 sense, it was a pragmatic solution, wasn't it? And Benetton even actually referenced it in their statement after related to the timing of the appeal hearing down the line, saying that it was about the concerns about unfairly penalising and disappointing the German fans. So yeah, it made sense for that to happen. I do wonder whether perhaps Benetton could have played it politically a little bit better. In fact, as you could say of a few things that Benetton did that year, if F1 and the FIA didn't want Schumacher to miss the German Grand Prix, then there's another solution, which is, well, pull the ban. Then that's another way of doing it. So maybe there was a better path there. I guess there were also practical elements, because obviously the original hearing that led to the ban obviously followed Silverstone, so there was a limit to how much time there was to get everything done. So I imagine that maybe played into it for a bit, and it obviously wasn't until Monza that the ban actually kicked in anyway. Had Hungary and Spa first, but yeah, it would have made sense for Benetton to miss Hockenheim, actually, not just because Schumacher didn't finish, but because they weren't as competitive as they were going to be. But there was a huge amount going on at this stage between Benetton and the FIA that has to be seen within that context as well. I'm actually pretty surprised Benetton didn't rent some offices in the Place de la Concorde for convenience, given how often they were summoned to France.
Yeah, they certainly could have racked up some loyalty points in Paris. It wasn't only Williams personnel that were getting hassled in the build-up to the race, as Damon Hill received a death threat warning him not to beat Schumacher in Germany. Hill wrote in his book that on arrival at Hockenheim, he was introduced to 2 German police officers who would take him to and from the track in a police car via a back entrance to the circuit. Damon said it felt very ominous, and he changed his hotel room to one booked under a different name. He also called in a well-built friend to visit him for the weekend, saying although he had no formal training, he was a big guy, and just having him around made me feel more secure. Damon said he did a reasonable job of putting the threat to the back of his mind until race day, when he sat on the back of an open-top car for the drivers' parade and felt exposed. He added, as we entered the vast stadium at the end of the lap, the 100,000 fans responded by cheering and waving and letting off bangers, the perfect cover for shooting some hapless racing driver. I hid behind David Coulthard, hoping they might hit him instead, but thankfully nothing happened. Ed, we won't spend too long on this, but was this a little glimpse of social media behaviour before the social media age?
Yeah, social media just magnifies and focuses human behaviour, doesn't it? And too often in the worst way possible. These things are really strange, aren't they? Because a lot of the time I think these threats are people who are almost playing some kind of game and don't really grasp what it is they're doing, and they're dealing with real people. They just get carried away with the general sort of back and forth, what's always called banter, which is a dangerous word because that's used to justify all sorts of terribleness. But there are also some who will maliciously revel in the effect they have, and also you will get the odd one that's serious, which is obviously a legitimate concern, and a subset of that might even actually attempt something. So you can't blame Damon Hill or anyone else targeted for that to be concerned about it. Difficult mindset to understand, though. It's fair to say then there was a higher bar, though. You had at the very least to have access to a fax machine and send a fax in order to do that. You couldn't just jump onto Twitter. It's very, very easy to do nowadays. But yeah, you can't blame anyone who's got any form of public profile, big or small, whether they're a sports person, public figure, anything. Even F1 journalists get the odd threat these days. So you can't blame people for being unsettled by that. But it's just horrendous and unnecessary, isn't it? And it just created a rather unpleasant tone. When these things overstep, yeah, okay, you want the home hero to win. No problem with that. You want the title rival to fail. No problem with that. But just keep it under control. And it's not limited to any particular fan base or any particular country. These things do crop up all over the place, which is a shame.
Yeah, it's a good point Ed makes there actually about it. You know, the fact that you have to take these cranks seriously sometimes, because you know a German fan did actually, Steffi Graf fan did actually stab Monica Seles. You know, so you know you have to actually look at who's threatening what.
Yeah, and as Ed said, I guess the thing is that back then it required a little more effort to make such a threat, but that probably meant if the person went through with it, they were more serious than a lot of the ones that we maybe see on social media today. Let's move back into an F1 story, and one of the biggest stories of 1994. Tony mentioned it at the start of the episode. This is all about a little thing called Option 13. And if you don't know what that means yet, don't worry, because you're about to become very informed. After the San Marino Grand Prix, the FIA decided to investigate the electronic black boxes of the top 3 cars from Benetton, Ferrari and McLaren to make sure the ban on driver aids for 1994 was being adhered to. However, FIA President Max Mosley later wrote in his book that the black boxes were returned before the investigation had finished, a mistake he said he made in all the confusion and stress following that disastrous weekend where F1 lost Ayrton Senna and Roland Ratzenberger. So the black boxes were seized again later in the season, with all 3 teams ordered to hand over their source code to make the investigation easier. Ferrari did so immediately, but Benetton and McLaren took a long time to do this, citing delays and confidentiality agreements with outside suppliers. This time, a launch control system was found in the Benetton software, but it was hidden in a menu that featured 10 options on screen. However, if you moved a mouse cursor further down the screen below that list and hit enter, it could enable option 13, which was launch control. Benetton had never denied that some driver aids still existed in its software. In fact, most teams had decided that disabling them was easier than rewriting the code to eliminate them. But Benetton had also declared that launch control could only be enabled by a recompilation of the source code. And as the late Charlie Whiting said in his full report on the matter, detailed analysis revealed this statement was not true. Whiting's report was released in full by the FIA after it had concluded that it did not have proof of Benetton using the system, so the team's only punishment for this was a $100,000 fine for being late supplying the source code. But the full report cast plenty of doubt on Benetton. Whiting added that when Benetton was confronted with the discovery that launch control could be enabled via a laptop, Benetton conceded it was possible, but indicated the availability of this feature came as a surprise to them. Whiting went on to say no satisfactory explanation was offered for this apparent attempt to conceal the feature, and in his conclusion he stated, "In the circumstances, I am not satisfied that car number 5 complied with the regulations at all times during the San Marino Grand Prix, and I therefore submit this matter to the World Council for their consideration." So Tony, we'll come to Benetton's side of the story in a moment and what you heard from Ross Brawn. But looking at what the FIA did here, was the release of Whiting's full report their way of hinting that despite not finding enough evidence, they weren't convinced?
Yes, Glenn, I think that about sums it up perfectly, because there'd been a lot of controversy about this right from the start of the season, basically, when Ayrton Senna, before he was killed at Imola, was convinced that the Benetton was running. Actually, it wasn't so much launch control as traction control. He was convinced that was the case. He'd been taken off on the first lap in Aida, and he'd actually stood by the Armco for a number of minutes watching the race, and he was convinced there was 2 different Benettons out there. He wasn't saying both Benettons, but so right from the start of the season, it had been an issue, and here was the first kind of. Well, it wasn't proof, but it wasn't proof that they were running it, obviously. But here was the first, tacit admission from the FIA that they did have some evidence, but they couldn't prove its use.
So let's get into Benetton's defence, because as we've mentioned, Ross Brawn gave a 45-minute press conference on the Friday of the Hockenheim weekend, which Tony was at, where Ross tried to lay out the team's side. On the subject of general suspicion about Benetton's performance and Schumacher's quick getaways in 1994, Brawn said, "Michael was useless at starts last year. He has developed a technique of using the clutch and throttle in a way that eliminates wheel spin. The risk involved with being caught and eliminated from the championship is tremendous. If we were foolish enough to use such a system willingly and be caught, we would be putting 200 people and their families' futures at risk. Our success has been gained by hard work and the talents of Michael Schumacher. Unfortunately, it is a cross we have to bear that people seem to look for easy reasons why we are successful. This is my third season with Benetton. Why didn't we do any cheating last year? We don't suddenly start cheating, particularly with the performance we've got and with the driver we've got. So Ed, I'll let you go first on this before we get into more detail and come to Tony's memories of the press conference. Is the argument Brawn has mapped out there plausible?
It's plausible, but it's not the strongest argument I've ever heard. Taking some of it, yeah, Schumacher probably did get better at starts. Drivers work on that kind of thing all the time, particularly someone like Schumacher. And you can't say just because he made some good starts, France is the one everyone cites, that doesn't prove anything. But equally, arguing one plausible thing doesn't cancel out other allegations. It's not really evidence, is it? The line about not doing anything last year is curious, though, because firstly, well, you could have been and not noticed. That's a possibility. But secondly, launch control, any related systems, traction control, etc., were legal in '93, so you wouldn't need to cheat to run them. Now, the whole situation is complicated. It's very difficult to be definitive on this whole thing. You asked me specifically about that argument that Brawn made, and what I'm saying is that wasn't especially compelling. Even the argument about the jobs that are at stake and the risks. Well, motorsport's full of examples of people who took risks and did cheat, so that doesn't automatically mean they wouldn't have done it. It's certainly very suspicious, the whole thing, wasn't it? But Benetton wasn't the only team that had software code on the car that was illegal. It was a question of whether they activated it, whether it was genuinely usable. And we also have to remember the other factor is that there are ways and means of achieving a set effect, let's say a launch control style effect, that would be legal. It's not just you can't do this, it's certain things you can't do. So there's that and the wider political landscape. So today it's actually very difficult to be certain across the board. You sort of have to lean towards innocent until proven guilty, although I think for this one, it's maybe one of those ones where if you use the civil court definition of balance of probabilities, that you get a slightly different conclusion. Very, very strange one, and we've still not got a completely satisfactory answer on exactly what was or wasn't going on.
That's a good point about it being harder to cheat in 1993 because so many things were legal. But let's go back to option 13. Brawn said Benetton had made the FIA aware of redundant driver aids that were still in the software from their use in 1993, and it was Benetton's belief that the systems could not be enabled to work on the car in 1994. Then Brawn explained there was a genuine belief by the engineer who had written the software that he had deleted references to it in that menu. So when he was asked the question, can you access launch control via the menu, he said, no, I've removed that from the menu. It was removed from the menu so that other engineers would not initiate it accidentally. In fact, by approaching the software from another direction, LDRA, which is the company investigating the black boxes, were able to find in the menu a feature we weren't aware was still present. It was never removed with the intent of trying to deceive anybody because all the software showed it was present. We weren't trying to conceal any features as we didn't consider it relevant. We had already let LDRA know that the feature was present in the software, so why would we try to conceal it? So Tony, take us to that Friday press conference. You heard all of this firsthand. Did it dampen any suspicions you might have had after reading Whiting's report?
Reading Whiting's report, it just intensified the whole thing because, as I say, from the start of the season, I mean, if we just put the season into context, basically, Ayrton Senna had joined Williams, the dominant team, and patently the best driver, and there was kind of an expectation that he would dominate. And then at the start of the season, that hadn't happened. And if you remember back to Brazil and that sort of shunt involving, Irvine Verstappen and Martin Brundle and everything, because coming back on the plane from that race, and I was writing a report about that accident and everything, and Irvine actually came and plonked himself on the seat next to me and started reading what I was writing, and then it was a bit unsettling. And then he stopped, and he just wasn't interested in who I thought, whether he deserved to be banned or this or that. All he could talk about was that about halfway into the race, he'd been lapped by both Schumacher and Senna, and all he could talk about was he could not believe that Senna was anywhere near that Benetton on the track. He said that the characteristics of the two cars when they went past him. So the Benetton was like a magic carpet, and the Williams was all over the road. He said how, and bear in mind he'd fallen out with Senna at the end of the previous year, in the Suzuka incident, and he had a bit of a downer on Ayrton at the time. And he said, I cannot believe that Ayrton was anywhere near Michael, in that race with the way the two cars were behaving. And then we had the AIDA thing as well, and this had been going on and on and on. And this was big news. This, here was the FIA saying we found this, but we can't prove he's used it. So Ross was really under the microscope, and it was, I remember the buzz in the paddock and everybody going to this thing, and it was like sort of Prime Minister's questions. It was almost like parties at the Garden number 10 kind of thing.
And did he convince you? Was his argument convincing enough, do you think?
I was still deeply suspicious, and all I did think was, this guy's an excellent politician. I thought, there's anything that he came up with, anything that was thrown at him, he did have a plausible answer. It's technology that you don't understand. And, it's probably quite easy to hoodwink a room full of journalists if you've done your preparation. But the whole thing was deeply suspicious. There was even people saying in the background that, the powers that be were saying, how the hell are we going to promote a championship with Senna in a Williams? Maybe the next best guy can play a little bit, and there was even someone saying that, until Senna had his accident, that was sort of accepted to give them a show. And then after that, they weren't supposed to do it anymore. You didn't know what to believe. It was just a bizarre time.
It's also worth noting of that bizarre time that this was a season that was racked with this kind of stuff, not just relating to Benetton. If you look back through Autosports from the early stages of the season and pre-season, there's all sorts of people throwing accusations around Williams being suspicious about someone's suspension, concerns about Ferrari, all sorts of things being chucked about because there'd been rule changes partly, that there was all of this happening. So it was very much that kind of culture and mindset of suspicion going on as well.
And another thing you have to remember is that Flavio hadn't been the smartest, and he had a pop at Max Mosley in a big way at the Spanish Grand Prix about all these changes that were being made to the car, and accused Max and the FIA of being incompetent and unfit to run the sport basically. And the one thing you probably don't do if you've got half a brain in your head is suggest that Max Mosley's incompetent and expect it not to have consequences.
Yeah, we'll come back to that in a minute. Because there was so much going on behind the scenes here, and internally at Benetton as well. And that's the story we'll come to first, because when Max let Briatore know what had been found in the black box investigation, Briatore called Brawn, telling him, "We are in trouble. Don't worry. I've done a deal. We're going to lose the points for Imola, but everything will be okay after that." Now, Brawn tells this story in his book, Total Competition, written with Adam Parr, and he said that his reaction to Flavio's deal was to resign along with designer Rory Byrne immediately because he felt the team had done nothing wrong. And Brawn said that convinced Briatore to go into battle. So Ed, given everything that went on around Benetton in 1994, which is an incredibly broad question, is there an argument that if they'd gone along with this deal cut between Max and Flavio, they might have avoided a lot of the other controversy that seemed to follow them around?
Yeah, it probably would have been a very wise deal to have taken. Of course, on paper, you can look at points and say it would have cost Schumacher the championship, but it would have had all sorts of knock-on effects on the other stuff that was going on. So who knows what the impact would have been. And it would have certainly de-escalated that polarisation between the FIA and Benetton to some extent. But at the same time, if you're Flavio Briatore, if you've got Ross Brawn and Rory Byrne threatening to resign because they're adamant nothing illegal was done, then I think you're obliged as the team principal to fight their corner, not just because you don't want to lose them, but because that's a strong position to take. And I don't think you're any kind of team boss or manager or whatever if you're not in that circumstances willing to fight that position. So I don't think this was a Briatore error. I think it was possibly a Brawn and Byrne error, but sometimes when people's integrity is being challenged, you do get these responses. So, yeah, who knows? But it could have saved a lot of trouble down the line, I suspect. And I imagine perhaps Ross Brawn and Rory Byrne might think in retrospect there were ways they could have done things better. And I know quite a few of the senior personnel in that team will accept today that that things were not done as they should have been. They didn't play their hands particularly well in that period. So yeah, maybe this was a fork in the road where they could have made a lot of the other problems go away.
Ross is very honest, actually, on kind of being thrown into the political deep water of F1 in this year. As Tony said, he could be a master of pulling the wool over people's eyes, but I think he had to do a lot of learning on the job. But let's come back to that Mosley versus Briatore stuff for a moment, because ultimately this was a personality clash between two fascinating characters. Briatore spoke at length about Mosley and 1994 in that F1 Beyond the Grid podcast interview with Tom Clarkson, so make sure you go and check that out because we're only going to touch on it here. Flavio said, "We know we were sabotaged by Max. Benetton winning was not really what Max wanted. Instead of saying the engineering of Benetton did a good job, in Formula 1, if you are Benetton, immediately if you do well, you are cheating. If it's Ferrari, fantastic. If it's McLaren, Ron Dennis's team is the best. If it's Williams, Frank did a fantastic job. Benetton, cheating. We don't have credibility, so we cannot build a car quicker than everybody else, but they never found the evidence. Max was interfering a lot with the sport. He was difficult to have a civilised conversation with because he was right all the time." So as Tony mentioned, there was a feeling that this relationship had spiralled after the Spanish Grand Prix, when Mosley had forced through the first wave of abrupt safety changes to the car. And Brawn expands on that story we hinted at, and he says there was a meeting that weekend where Briatore and Tom Walkinshaw came out saying Max has resigned, he's gone, he's finished. This is when Briatore also wrote the open letter to Mosley, where he said, "You continue to insist on these ill-conceived measures. It is our opinion that the ability of yourself and your advisors to judge technical and safety issues in Formula 1 must be questioned." And Brawn's summary, looking back on this for his book, was they had stabbed the beast, but they hadn't killed it. Then it became very unpleasant after that. So, Tony, as a two-part question, really, did Max have it in for Benetton, or do we have to accept that it takes two to tango for a relationship to turn so sour?
No, I wouldn't say Max had it in for Benetton. I'd say Max had it in for anybody who, made accusations such as him being incompetent. At the time, we were only 3 years into Mosley's reign, if you like. And, he was around for another 15 years. And it took him another 15 years to get Flavio, didn't he? But he got him in the end, And, it might not be as simple as that, obviously, but they were, you don't make accusations like that, about Mosley and come away scot-free. So I think, did he have it in for them? I wouldn't say. I think, in a way, Benetton was actually an answer to, not necessarily his prayers, but Eccleston's prayers as a promoter. And obviously, but Bernie and Flav were close as well. So on the one hand, having a competitive Benetton was great, but on the other, he'd come and said draconian penalties if anybody uses these driver aids, and it didn't end up being exactly draconian, did it, at the end? But he was being put on the spot, Mosley, and he didn't like it.
Let's get to the track action then. Qualifying seemed to prove Briatore's theory about wanting to miss this race to be correct, as Schumacher lined up only fourth on the grid behind a Ferrari front row lockout of Berger and Alesi, with Hills Williams third. The other team that starred in qualifying was Tyrrell, which had Ukyo Katayama fifth and Mark Blundell seventh as they sandwiched David Coulthard in the second Williams. What followed was one of the most chaotic starts to a Grand Prix ever, and we'll come back to DC being sandwiched in a different way shortly. At the back, Andrea De Cesaris and Alex Zanardi collided before they'd even crossed the start line, and in the process they took out the Minardis of Michele Alboreto and Pierluigi Martini. As if that wasn't enough, closer to the front there was more chaos at the first corner, when Mika Hakkinen veered from the inside of the track across slightly into the path of Coulthard. Their collision sent Hakkinen's McLaren spearing across to the barriers on the outside, and as several cars tried to avoid collecting Hakkinen, they all collided with each other or ended up in the gravel as well. Behind that, Martin Brundle and Johnny Herbert had their own collision at the first corner, which spun Brundle and put Herbert out on the spot. In total, 10 cars were out of the race because of all those incidents, and there was an 11th first lap retirement when a Lacey's car broke down on the run to the first chicane. Everyone was convinced the race would be red flagged. On the TV commentary, Murray Walker even called the rest of the opening lap academic. But when Berger led Schumacher and the remaining cars onto the start-finish straight again, they were met with course cars, marshals and officials everywhere on the circuit, but only yellow flags. Alboreto was furious about this, leaving the track immediately, which earned him a one-race suspended ban because he'd not been cleared by the stewards to leave the circuit after being involved in an accident. But Michele said, "I left because I was pissed off. After Senna's crash, we asked the FIA to stop races where an accident could have left debris on the track because we still don't know what happened. Have people already forgotten that?" Eddie Irvine, who was also out, made a follow-up point, saying it was a strange decision not to stop the race, and with 11 of the 26 cars out at the start, it's bad for the spectators. So Tony, you were there, you saw and probably heard all of this going on. There was so much crunching of carbon fibre. What did you make of it, and should the race have been stopped?
To be honest, Glenn, with all the ag going on in the paddock and everything, the race was almost an irrelevance. But no, I think it probably should have been because, as Michele had said, he was really pissed off that after Ayrton's accident, where at the time it was thought debris might have been a contributory factor, that they would, particularly a quick place like Hockenheim, they would actually stop the race in a situation like that. But the two major players were still in it. I mean, Hill and Schumacher were still in it. So it kept carried on, and I don't think anybody was in a compromising situation too badly. But I think. Yeah, it probably should have been stopped.
Let's go back to Hakkinen, because his role in causing the first corner collision triggered a suspended ban he already had hanging over him for leaving the track at the British Grand Prix without the steward's clearance after an accident of his own that weekend. At the time, Hakkinen felt this ban was a bit hard, but he and McLaren accepted it without appealing. It was his third accident of the weekend, which Mika said was enough to give me a headache. Hakkinen came in for some criticism in the specialist press. In Autosport, Nigel Roebuck wrote, "Hakkinen, I believe, needs to calm himself a little in the race car. Mika belongs in that tiny circle of the ultimately quick, but there have been too many accidents this year. My feeling is that the one race ban will do him no harm at all and may well do some good." And in Motorsport magazine, David Tremaine added, "One day Mika will learn that merely ignoring people you think you've overtaken doesn't mean that they aren't still there." So Tony, Hakkinen was building a bit of a reputation by this point. Do you think he needed that little reset on the sidelines to calm things down?
I don't really think so. I mean, I felt a bit sorry for Mika, to be honest, because I thought he was hugely talented for a very long time, even from Vauxhall Lotus days, and he'd had to wait a long time for an opportunity. And he'd come in the end of the previous year when they, got rid of Michael Andretti, and he had qualified Ayrton first time up in Portugal, and then raced really well in Japan as well. And here we were. This was his opportunity, his first, full season, and the thing was going bang every 5 minutes. So I think he was keen to get through turn one because he might not have been still going by the time they got to turn six. So yeah. You got to cut him a bit of slack. I think he's a young guy who knew he was talented, trying to establish himself.
Now, interestingly, Hakkinen believes this ban had a big impact on the rest of his career. In an interview with Motorsport magazine in 2010, he said, "I was aggressive, yes, and people decided I needed a slap on the wrist. Everybody said, 'Chill out, Mika, you need to relax.' So I took their advice, and I think it was a mistake. Even today, I regret that. By the time I was racing Michael Schumacher for the championship, I was more relaxed than him. I should have continued to go for it everywhere and stayed aggressive. If I'd done that, I would have been a very different guy against Michael." Ed, do you perhaps agree with Hakkinen's summary there? And hypothetically, what do you make of the prospects of a more aggressive Mika Hakkinen doing battle with Michael Schumacher?
It's a really interesting thought. Obviously, you would usually favour Michael Schumacher in a wheel-to-wheel battle against Hakkinen. So there was certainly room for Hakkinen to be more aggressive. But you'd also have to ask if he really needed to be a different character, a different driver against Schumacher, given he did win 2 world championships. So who knows? Maybe it would have given Hakkinen a 3rd title, or maybe he needed that contrasting style to take on and beat Schumacher. I might just be saying this because I like rivalries where you see slightly different approaches. And I think the fact they were towards opposite ends of the spectrum when they were battling for titles down the line was quite interesting. But it does reflect how important that year was in forming Hakkinen, because not only did he start to get the results, usually when the car held together, he was on the podium at the end of the race. It's just it didn't hold together a lot, and there were a number of incidents as well. So he was really coming good as a driver and becoming kind of a proper F1 driver, almost, if you like. So I'd rather he dialed it back too much than not enough. And I quite like the laid-back, relaxed Mika Hakkinen. Who am I to disagree with him about his career? He knows better. So if Mika says it, he's probably right. But I'd be very, very careful about changing those strengths that made Hakkinen work well. I'm sure the fact that he was quite relaxed, but could be quite intense when he needed to be, actually was a useful weapon up against Schumacher, and maybe that increased the respect that we know Schumacher felt for him. It's a fascinating what if, and you'll never get to the bottom of it. But any driver will look back and probably think about things they could have done differently, and that's a really interesting observation from Hakkinen. It tells us exactly how hard that bandit hit him.
I think if Mika had been more aggressive against Michael, they'd have collided, just like most of Schumacher's rivals did with him at some point, and then he probably wouldn't be Michael's favourite championship rival. But let's get back to the race, because more contenders fell by the wayside early on. As Tony mentioned, Hill was still in the race after all the shenanigans at the start, but it only took him until the 3rd chicane to collide with the fast-starting Katayama as he tried to take 3rd place from the Tyrrell on the opening lap. And that sent Damon back to the pits for suspension repairs, where he had to queue behind Coulthard, who was in for a new nose after the Hakkinen incident. And Katayama's run near the front didn't last long either, as throttle problems soon put him out. However, right at the front, Schumacher was hassling Berger, and Berger was defending hard, but he did get a breather when the 2-stopping Benetton came into the pits for the first time. However, it was Benetton's next pit stop that everyone remembers from this race. Jos Verstappen pitted from 5th place after 15 laps, and what happened next was utterly terrifying. I'm going to read out the description of this from Benetton mechanic Steve Matchett, who has gone on to become an established author and F1 expert on TV. Steve wrote a book about the 1994 season called Life in the Fast Lane, which I definitely recommend. In 1994, he was the rear jackman at Benetton pit stops, and here's a snapshot of what he wrote about this unforgettable moment of horror from the moment some fuel splashed out of the hose and went over Verstappen's car. Matchett wrote, "My next thought was relief that it hadn't instantly erupted. When after a moment or two the fuel hadn't caught fire, the crew moved back towards the car in an attempt to finish changing the wheels. It was this precise moment, about 2 seconds after the fuel spray, that it finally ignited. My vision of the car was suddenly replaced by a bright light as a sea of white flame erupted out of the fuel. It washed over and engulfed the car in an enormous fireball. At the same time, there was a loud rushing noise similar to the air movement in an underground station just before the train arrives. A fraction later, I felt the heat of the burning fuel through my gloves. I remember thinking that it didn't seem as intense as I had expected. It was hot, but not painfully so. The white light changed to bright yellow, then to orange. Shapes began to form, and I could once again focus on the scene in front of me. My gloves and overalls had caught fire, but there was no shock or panic at this stage. I suppose it was too soon for that. I just thought this whole situation seems very odd. I remember thinking, okay, you're alive. You're on fire, but at least you're alive. You ought to think about putting yourself out. Try rolling on the floor. That should do it." Now, interestingly, Steve also wrote that when he finally saw the fire back on TV, he was surprised at how dramatic it had been and how high the flames had risen. Fortunately, the fire was put out after only 6 or 7 seconds, and Verstappen was in the process of getting out of the car by then. Nobody was seriously injured, but several of the crew members had received varying levels of burns. There's a lot more to that story from Steve, so if you want to read it in full, make sure you look up Life in the Fast Lane by Steve Matchett. But Tony, you were there. You said there was lots going on in the paddock that weekend, but if all the shunts at the start hadn't got your attention, I imagine this did.
Yeah, it certainly did, because it had been widely predicted since the announced refueling was coming back, and it's just the amount of flame, and it seemed a much bigger fire. I think in the end it was proved to have been between sort of 2 and 4 liters of fuel that actually caused that inferno, and it may only have been 6 or 7 seconds, but it certainly seemed big enough and long enough to have done serious injury to people. So, there was a big worry.
Verstappen admitted afterwards that he'd had a bit of trouble getting the steering wheel off and releasing his seatbelts in the middle of the fire, which I think we can all understand. He reflected on this in 2019 on the F1 Beyond the Grid podcast, saying, "It all went dark and you can't breathe when you're in the middle of it. The best place where it can happen was in the pit lane with all the fire extinguishers around." And Jos added, "I really didn't mind. We are racing. It's dangerous. It was fine to me." The fire, of course, meant another investigation into all things Benetton, and during the course of the refuelling equipment being inspected on the Tuesday after the race, it was found that a filter had been removed from the fuel nozzle, which it was suspected meant some debris had got in there and prevented the valve from closing as it should whenever the nozzle is not connected fully to the car. Mosley wrote about this in his book, saying the removed filter reduced the time of a pit stop by about a second, but Benetton got away with it just, so far as we were concerned, by claiming a junior employee had removed the filter and that someone from the fuel rig manufacturer had given permission for this. To our considerable surprise, a representative of the fuel rig manufacturer confirmed the story. Matchett took issue with this version of events in his 1994 book. He said the filter in question was a late addition to the equipment because some teams had complained of finding debris from the machining process in the kit when it was initially delivered, but Benetton always thoroughly stripped and cleaned its equipment and had never found anything in there. He also disputed the theory of debris allowing the valve to open to let the fuel out, as he felt that if that was the case, the fuel would have kept spraying. Fuel flowed through the hose at around 13 to 14 litres per second, and as Tony mentioned, Benetton calculated that between 2 and 6 litres were spilled in the splash. Matchett also said that if there was anything suspicious about Benetton removing that filter, they had until the inspection 2 days later to put it back in, but they'd never tried to hide that it had been removed. So Ed, pick the bones out of all that. What do you reckon?
Well, the key question here is, if it wasn't a small bit of debris that the removed filter would have eliminated, then what did cause the escape of the fuel? Now, at the time, Benetton stated they felt the FIA's conclusion wasn't quite correct. They cited an external company they'd had look into it with specialism in accident investigation, and they agreed. Now, this is a witness for the defence, isn't it? So there's a few problems with expert witnesses for that. So that in itself isn't enough, and it didn't offer a contrary explanation. But it did seem Benetton had a contrary explanation. Yeah, down to a piece of debris, but it was down to... But this piece of debris got into a place that existed as a result of clashing manufacturing tolerances on a few parts in the refuelling valve coupling. So if you imagine you have two components, and let's say you have, for the sake of argument, a 1mm tolerance in each, and then they kind of both at extreme ends of the tolerance, and you put them together, you've got some mismatch and a problem. So the idea was it may have been a small chunk of tyre debris, a little marble that got caught in it, easily could have been picked up while Verstappen was on track, and then that just happened to get caught in the wrong place. Then you got the escape. So that's a plausible explanation, certainly, and definitely no less plausible than the official one. And then you have to ask, well, if that was what happened, then why wasn't it something that came out at the time? And then that's when the politics comes in. We know it suited everyone to conclude that Benetton was at fault for the fuel filter, because if Benetton wasn't at fault, then the refuelling equipment was at fault. And that was a huge talking point that year, whether the Intertechnic refuelling rigs were fit for purpose, whether they were safe, etc. And Benetton itself was also not the only team that had removed this filter. I believe Ligier had done as well. In fact, the suggestion is that Benetton found out they could do it by the ownership connection with Ligier, because Ligier had originally requested it. So there are others doing it. I can't believe Benetton would take a risk of removing a filter unless they were 100% confident it would be safe to do so. And we know that they said they told Charlie Whiting about it, and there was a permission from the refuelling rig company to do it. The risk of fire was huge, and if you're going to be willing to put your pit crew at risk in order to gain some time on a pit stop, which is said to be a second or just over on the average pit stop, but some contend it was less, then you've got to question if that's a sensible decision and one that they would have taken. And we do know also there were problems with the equipment ahead of the season. They had to make some changes to that fuel valve. They had to put a stronger spring in it on one occasion, for example, to make sure it sort of coupled correctly. So yeah, I'm inclined on this one to think there is plenty of room for Benetton not to have been entirely guilty of this. There were some strange things going on, certainly. So Matchett may well be correct on that one. And I've got to throw in a very quick tangent as to how seriously the fire risk was taken. Ligier, because they were very concerned about this, conducted a fuel flyer simulation pre-season to see what might happen. They dumped 40 litres of fuel in the field and set fire to it. And you know what? It blew up. So the conclusion there was if you ignite F1 fuel, it goes up pretty spectacularly. No idea what they added to the wealth of knowledge about fire risk from that, but I'm sure they had great fun doing it. But that shows how seriously everyone was taking it if Ligier was setting fire to fields to test things.
Yeah, any excuse to mention Ligier. That reminds me of a time at a kart race that my dad tried to speed up a slow lighting barbecue by pouring some petrol on it. And the black cloud was seen from the other side of the paddock and people came over, rushing over with fire extinguishers and that sort of thing. But back to Benetton, because their day went from very bad to even worse 5 laps after the fire when Schumacher cruised back to the pits with a sick-sounding engine. And it was only obviously once Michael stepped into the garage and saw the state of Verstappen's car and mechanics still tending to themselves that he realised something else had gone on in the pits already. But this might have been a blessing in disguise for Benetton, Schumacher retiring that is, as it was suggested they wouldn't have had enough crew members in a fit state for Schumacher's second pit stop if he'd made it that far into the race. This left Berger out front with no opposition to cruise to Ferrari's first win since 1990 and the first win of the Jean Todt era. Naturally, both Berger and Schumacher felt they would have won the race if their battle had gone to the wire. Berger said Schumacher 2-stopping meant he wouldn't have been a problem against the 1-stopping Ferrari, while Schumacher said he was sure he would have got into the lead eventually. Berger also said years later for an interview that was part of an F1 Greatest Races DVD and is now available on F1 TV, that he'd been surprised how close Schumacher sat behind him in that first stint, and Berger thought even then that Michael might overheat his engine. He also said to get Ferrari's first win for a long time was special because it was proof they were now on the road back to success. So Tony, amongst all the madness of this weekend, on track and off it, how special and significant did it feel to see Ferrari take this long-awaited next victory?
To me, not at all. Ferrari at the time was pretty much an irrelevance, and it's funny. I suppose it's all down to I first got into it in sort of '69, watching Stuart Rins. At Silverstone, and Ferrari weren't especially competitive then, and this sort of great thing about Ferrari. As I mentioned before, I think 90 they weren't there. They weren't there 91. 91, 92 they were awful. 93 they were awful. So, yeah, okay. 95 they weren't particularly great either, and it was 97 before they were a threat again. So it was just a circumstance, and I sort of feel fairly confident that had Schumacher not retired, he'd have probably won the race. And maybe Gerhard's got a point. Maybe he did actually follow too closely and lead to the overheating problems that actually caused the engine to go, which, funnily enough, was actually part of the discussion behind the scenes about the warm-up lap at Silverstone. When he actually overtook Damon and shouldn't have. There was rumours that Damon had actually driven the lap very, very slowly because he was told that the HB and the Benetton actually had cooling issues, and Michael had actually come out to actually get some heat through, to get some cooling through the radiators. So, there were obviously issues there with the HB. So, maybe Gerhard's got a point, but Ferrari winning the race, all anybody could talk about was Benetton and launch control, traction control, fuel filters, and okay, so great to see Gerhard win a race, and I think a lot of people felt for him because obviously he'd been very close to the Ayrton situation, so great to see him win that, and he'd been very open and very honest at a press conference we had in Monaco, after the Senna death, about the way he felt about carrying on and all this kind of thing. So So yeah, that was great from that perspective. But Ferrari, I don't think it meant much really, apart unless you're Italian.
I can offer a slightly contrary view because obviously I was a 14-year-old fan at the time. I do remember the Ferrari thing being quite a big deal, actually, getting a win after that long drought. And I suspect that's probably just a difference in perspective, in that, yes, all the stuff you described going on, Tony, was effectively more important. But I think the Ferrari coming back had quite a big impact on people watching on the outside. Certainly I remember being, obviously it wasn't at 2 Ligiers on the podium or Larousse getting a point or 2 arrows in the points, but yeah, it still made quite a big impact. So I think maybe in the wider world, to the F1 fans, it meant a little bit more, not just in Italy.
Ed, your Ligier question is coming up. Stop saying Ligier. You offered a counterpoint then to Tony's view on the Ferrari win. What about the question of Schumacher versus Berger if it had continued? Do you have a contrary point to Tony's theory there? Who do you think would have won this race if the battle had gone to the flag?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and it would have all come down to the pace of Schumacher in the second half of his middle stint compared to Berger in the early laps of his second stint. That wouldn't have been a huge window, but Schumacher was closing on Berger at a decent rate after his stop, despite presumably having a little bit more fuel on board. I think at the end of lap 13, so that's the end of Schumacher's outlap, he was 23.5 seconds behind. Then it came down to 20.3 seconds over the next 4 laps. I think it was 5 to 6 tenths faster for the first 2 laps, and then he was 1.1 and then 0.9 seconds faster. Then the engine started to get sick. So if we take a fairly generous closing rate from that, just say a second a lap, because that's quite convenient, then he'd have probably been 17 and a half seconds behind Berger when Berger pitted, assuming he did it at the end of lap 20 as he did in the real race. So let's say Berger has the same slow stop he did have in the real race, then Schumacher's lead would probably have been 12, 13 seconds, something like that. So given he'd lost 24 seconds to Berger at the first stop, that leaves him 12 seconds to find, a bit more than that to be absolutely comfortable. These are very rough numbers. So he'd have needed to have been very quick, because I don't think that second stint would have gone on too much longer. It would be sensible for that to be the longest stint of his race, but at the same time you might fuel him a little bit shorter in the hope of getting the jump. And I think given what we saw in the early stages of the race, Schumacher would have needed to come out of the pits ahead, because if he was behind, unless Berger made a proper mistake, I don't think he'd been able to overtake. He tried to in the early stages and didn't. So you take that and then you throw in the state of the pit crew after the fire. And I think that's kind of the clincher that means I'm fairly happy to say I think Berger definitely would have won. If the Verstappen fire hadn't happened, then it could have been very interesting. I think Schumacher would have been, he'd been in the Hungary spec, give me X number of qualifying laps now to close the gap, and it could have been pretty close at pit exit. But as it happened, it didn't go that way. Maybe they pushed the engine too hard, and maybe the pit stop wouldn't have gone well anyway, given the decimated pit crew and the fact that they're having to cobble something together. So, yeah, probably in a normal race close, the race that probably would have happened had Schumacher held together, I think the pit stop thing would have made the difference.
It's a very valid point. If you go and watch this footage back, Michael isn't just sort of sat a second behind Gerhard in that opening stint. He is trying to bump draft him down the straights to try and keep up with him and to get anywhere near him into a braking zone. He's really tucked up under Berger's rear wing. So yeah, there wasn't much cool air going into that engine in the first part of the race. But despite Ed jeopardising this next question, we will come to the main reason Ed is on this episode, and that's to discuss the rest of the points finishers. Berger was joined on the podium then by the 2 Ligiers of Olivier Panis and Eric Bernard. Next up were the 2 footworks of Christian Fittipaldi and Gianni Morbidelli, and the final point went to Eric Comas in, of all things, a Larousse. So, Ed, the floor is now yours. Tell us how the rest of that top 6 made you feel, and is there a valid argument against stopping this race at the start, because these teams deserve the chance to be rewarded on the days that they're the ones who manage to stay out of trouble?
Well, as I mentioned at the start, I was definitely delighted by it. Race result is really imprinted on my mind because of that. I can reel off all the finishers. There are only 8 of them, so it's not actually that impressive, admittedly. But it was great to see Ligier, Arrows and Larousse have a good day. I think Arrows had a 4th place earlier in the season, maybe the Pacific Grand Prix with Fittipaldi. But Ligier and Larousse had very difficult seasons. So, yeah, great for them to have points. In terms of that race start, I'm pleased it wasn't stopped because it did facilitate that result. But you decide on whether to red flag a race based on whether it's necessary to. And I think given the number of cars and the necessary recoveries and the marshals on tracks and recovery vehicles, it should have been red flagged. And I do think it was largely pot luck whether you were involved in the various crashes at the start. Okay, a few drivers triggered them, but for the most part, there were people who just couldn't have done anything about it. But it is the kind of result that you couldn't have now, because it would be red flagged and rightly so. But that was at a time in Formula One where you could still get these extraordinary results just by getting to the finish of a race. Okay, we were gradually moving towards an era where that was getting harder and harder, and the disparity between the haves and the have-nots got ever bigger. But yeah, it was great to see some underdogs do well. Although, as I mentioned before, Ligier were more underachievers than underdogs in this year, given the kit they should have had at their disposal. But yeah, this race is made all the better for the fact that it was such a preposterous podium.
Ukio Katayama could have been second.
He could have been. And there's a great subplot in 1994, which as a 14-year-old Damon Hill fan that year, I was very aware of, in that you can credit Ukio Katayama with denying Damon Hill the World Championship, because he had that little clash with Damon Hill on the first lap of the German Grand Prix, because Hill, I think, got through the first corner stuff and the start stuff unscathed, but then picked up a bit of damage tangling with Katayama and went to the pit. So he did finish, but he lost huge amounts of time, so couldn't score. So that, combined with the fact, I think Katayama, right at the end of the San Marino Grand Prix, an aggregate race, had managed to jump ahead of Hill, denied Hill 1 point in Imola, who knows how many points in Hockenheim. So forget the Adelaide collision, 94 title was denied Damon Hill by Ukio Katayama. Who'd have thought it?
That's why people come to bring back V10s. I was going to say that we've done Katayama and Tyrrell and their pace that weekend a disservice by not talking about it, but we've now credited him with deciding the World Championship, so I think we've evened things out. We'll leave it there for Hockenheim 1994, another crazy time in F1 with so many storylines that would have been the biggest talking point of any normal weekend if they'd been the only thing of note that had happened, but instead they all collided, much like half the field did at the start of the race. Special thank you to Tony for joining us for the first time to give us your personal perspective of being there in the thick of it that weekend. Hopefully we can have you on again in the future, and really Ed should be thanking me for letting him talk about Ligier getting a double podium and a Larousse in the points. Next time we're revisiting a happier weekend for Schumacher and Benetton as we head back to the 1992 Belgian Grand Prix, where 1 year on from his short but memorable debut for Jordan at Spa, Schumacher took the first of his 91 F1 victories.